There's no doubt in my mind that Australia's major political parties are in serious trouble. But does it matter? Those of us who fret about this, simply unreconstructed idealists who don't know that the world's changed? I don't think so. Indeed, I strongly believe that you can't have a proper parliamentary system, a proper democracy, when the parties exist in name only, as I believe is the case now, especially when nothing else is being offered in their place. A survey by some Adelaide academics of the Australian political parties concluded that Australians don't care much for political parties, a masterly understatement, with 67% expressing little or no confidence in political parties and only 9% agreeing that the parties have high standards in the conduct of their internal affairs. That perhaps explains why so few people want to join political parties. I think it's true to say that voters in Australia actually have very little choice but to endorse one or other of the major political parties, eventually, given our system of voting. And they have come to regard them, in a sense, as a necessary evil. Most of them hate the political manoeuvring, the factions, the backbiting, the branch stacking, and the incomprehensible alliances that dog both the major parties. Sometimes, of course, they'll have a third-party vote, the Greens or One Nation or Family First, but in the end, they can't avoid the reality that government will be formed by Labor or the Coalition. It's their structures and processes, their values and policies, or lack of them, which feed into government and determine the future of our country. So it matters a lot that they're failing. And very few Australians, of course, are part of this determination. We've never had mass parties in Australia, but that doesn't diminish the significance of the declining health of the major parties for our democracy. Our already rudimentary political parties are dying. They stagger on in name only as corporate engines for managing elections, with a shrinking, ageing and increasingly marginalised membership base, for whom I feel very sorry. About 1% or less of Australians actually belong to political parties. Some of them don't even know that they do. They've been signed up. Real power within the parties is concentrated, in other words, in fewer and fewer hands. Factions control the branches, and in Labor's case the union delegates, and manoeuvre for control of seats or regions which then become their kingdoms, their fiefdoms. The parties have become self-perpetuating oligarchies. And this is not just true of the Labor Party, which is the one that's most often criticised. You'll see it too in the Liberal and National parties. Genuine members, fewer and fewer of them, are overwhelmed by the branch stackers, controlled by a handful of power brokers, but they're still expected to turn out on election day to staff the polling booths. But there are not even enough members for this very limited role. The Liberals, I know, have been paying their booth workers for a long time, but neither party can now get enough people out there. They have to rely on friends and relations. Both a cause and an effect of this decline is the relentless transformation, I would argue, of Australia's political parties into corporations. Most people would probably be surprised to learn that the party machines they've heard so much about are really a few paid officials, MPs and their staff, with some input from that membership I talked about. One correspondent put it to me that we're dealing here with ramshackle top-down corporations which market products cooked up in the back rooms. The old ideologies which we understood have been replaced by a managerial culture and poll-driven spin, by disquieting alliances with large corporations and large organisations. And the major parties' agendas are so similar that they offer very little in the way of choice for voters. In place of what should be robust disagreements and debates about our future, the public dialogue has shrunk to repetitious sound bites which stay on message. Now, political parties aren't the only bodies to contribute to this, but they've made their contribution to reduce Australian political debate to an ugly rivalry between equally mindless slogans, with concentration on image, the ephemera of personality contests, the focus groups used to transform people's fleeting itches into enduring needs. And yet the parties continue to occupy a pivotal, indeed a privileged role in our political system. They are, in the argument, held to be central to the functioning of modern democracies, if you read all the texts. Indeed, you can't find a representative democracy that appears to operate without parties. They are, in other words, key institutions which we shouldn't allow to languish, because they link the people with the parliament. They create political identities. They frame electoral choices. They recruit candidates. They organise elections. They define the structure of legislation and determine the outputs of government. So we can't ignore them. For better or worse, they're firmly established in the political landscape. And they are still the main intermediaries between people and power. They shape those political debates and choices, or they should, and determine, for example, who will be presented for election from what I think is an increasingly shallow gene pool of members. They are the principal mechanism in mass representative democracies for ensuring that people get more or less what they voted for, so that if you vote for a particular party at the election with a known policy agenda, it will be delivered. That's the theory, at least. But I think it's worth remembering that parties aren't mentioned in our Constitution, and despite public funding, substantial public funding, are barely regulated. Paradoxically, as parties are declining at the electorate level with so few members, the influence and control of those central party organisations, those corporations, on campaigns and at the parliamentary level is stronger than ever. Parties, in other words, are pervasive, ubiquitous and dominant at every level of the political process. But they're neither democratic nor representative, attributes you might expect in a democratic system. The reason that they were previously considered legitimate is it was assumed that their members mirrored the community at large. They could play that role of brokerage between the community and their representatives. They could be trusted to represent the people in developing policies and choosing candidates for election. Now, I think it's fair to say that none of our political parties has ever been truly representative. They left out women for a long time, Indigenous Australians, recent migrants, but in broad terms they did represent most segments of society. But as the major parties have hollowed out and control of the major decisions has been restricted to fewer and fewer hands, even that very limited success in representing the wider community, I would argue, has been lost. Now, I have to say it clearly suits those who hold power to reduce the number of players. Much easier to control them then. And there's less competition for prized seats and positions. To come to rely on the corporate sector and public funding to raise the funds, no more chook raffles, and to vest policy making in the hands of the members of parliament and their staff. They don't need to consult with anyone else. In fact, in my time it was pretty clear that ideologically motivated members were regarded as a distraction, a nuisance indeed, obstacles to the smooth functioning of a lean and efficient professional political machine whose direction is governed by studying opinion polls and focus groups rather than shared party ideology. It may suit the apparatchiks, but let me tell you, it's bad for democracy. Parties are crucial actors in our democracy, influential in determining the character and direction of our society. They can't be allowed to be the playthings of a few. At the very least, they should be more representative and more democratic. The Australian people can reasonably argue that the party's privileged status in our system and their receipt of generous public funding should demand no less. The major political parties right now are really failing the Australian people. Thank you.
Senator Kroger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, what we have just heard was an extraordinary address from Dr. Carmen Lawrence, claiming that the major political parties are failing the Australian people, when she has been a serious player in a major political party, and we heard during the introduction of her, for no less than 21 years. She was the Premier of Western Australia, she was a federal minister, And upon her retirement from politics, rather than taking up golf as a hobby, I would suggest she became the national president of the ALP. If someone in those positions doesn't have a capacity to make a difference within the party, then I would suggest it's a reflection on the person and not a reflection on the party itself. In my mind, actions speak louder than words. And if you were all members of the ALP National Conference, I think you might have heard a somewhat different address than what you have just heard tonight. It would be reasonable to suggest that those on the table beside me here are strange bedfellows, and we probably share that view with you. But Shaun Carney will be prosecuting the case as a freedom fighter within the media to make sure that we politicians are accountable and honest. Senator Penny Wong, a colleague in the Senate, Minister of Finance and Deregulation, clearly also has a great abiding interest in carbon pricing, carbon taxing, emissions trading, and is a climate change warrior. What we will do is prosecute the case that the major parties are not failing the voters here in Australia. The ALP, and I think in particular the Coalition, still offer the best opportunity for all Australians to realise their aspirations, not the dangerous policies of some minor parties like the Greens. The fight for freedom, liberty and justice unites us all on this side, and we will demonstrate the strength of the political process through the continuing viability of the major political parties in Australia. The Liberal Party has a long and vibrant history. Founded by Sir Robert Menzies with the support of Dame Elizabeth Couchman, then President of the Australian Women's National League some close to 70 years ago, it was a party forged to represent mainstream Australia. A party that is egalitarian, that promotes the rights of individual, the freedom of association, the right for choice, and most importantly, the right for individuals and enterprises to be self-regulating, to have the capacity to control their own destiny, rather than a Big Brother socialist-inspired view that government knows best. It is these very values and principles that underscore today our approach to policy and the hard decisions that must be made when in office. As a former state president of the Liberal Party here in Victoria and now as a member in the Senate, I am mindful of who controls and wields influence in Australia. Within the Liberal Party, it is the grassroots, it's the members. And I am concerned to hear Dr. Lawrence suggest that membership is light on. The speech that is treated with reverence to this day in the Liberal Party is the address that was given by Sir Robert Menzies, known as the Forgotten People, delivered on the 22nd of May 1942. This was a speech that defined the middle-class values of Australia and, in so doing, the constituency of the Liberal Party. It's these very members, and I'm proud to say some 14,000 here in Victoria, many of these members who raised a hue and cry after Liberal Party preferences ensured Adam Bant became the member for Melbourne. So why was this such a big deal for us in the Liberal Party? Because the members and supporters outside the party believed that we had traded our core values and beliefs for the price of political expediency. In this process, we lost more than Shylock's pound of flesh. We had sacrificed our principles, and no electoral success could compensate for selling out what you believe in. In the lead-up to the state elections, some 3 months later, the public were understandably cynical. they faced the prospect that the Greens, a minor party, might extend their platform to pursue their radical ideology. Bob Brown and his merry men were emboldened, and they were predicting a win to the Greens of 4 to 6 inner Melbourne seats here, as they pronounced that the major political parties were failing Australians. Discontent over the Greens and their policies resonated amongst the grassroots of the Liberal Party, who were fearful that the party were deserting their own and going to deal with the devil. It was this chorus of discontent that I reflected when I publicly argued that the Liberal Party should not get into bed with the Greens or any other minor party for that matter. There was not a single policy or platform that we shared. Yet the election of Green members in the lower house in Victoria was dependent upon Liberal preferences or Labor Party preferences, and how they cried foul. In my mind, minor parties, just as the major parties, need to be accountable for their decisions and, if supported, would accordingly achieve electoral success. The decision made by the leadership of the state party here not to preference the Greens was seen as a strongly principled decision. As a major party, we would not horse trade for short-term expediency, but rather proudly stand up for what we believed in. It was a defining moment in that state campaign and was richly rewarded with electoral success. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no greater recent example of a major party being accountable to the voter, listening to its supporters and accordingly responding to what is needed. On Capitol Hill, the mismanagement that we are seeing at the moment is not an example of a major party failing voters, but rather an example of one that will do whatever it takes to cling to power. Kevin Rudd and the carbon tax are tragically potent examples of this. The carbon tax that was categorically ruled out by the Prime Minister before the election, and a tax that was clearly supported by Adam Bant, is now being foisted upon us all. What we have in Canberra is not a political party in control, but an alliance of convenience between the ALP, the Greens and independents in promoting a very mixed agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, don't judge the effectiveness of major parties by the example of the current government that resides on Capitol Hill.
Remember the spirit of respectful engagement. Greg Barnes.
The question is, are both major political parties failing us? You betcha they are. And this proposition is no better exemplified than their abject failure over the past decade to uphold that fundamental pillar of liberal democracy, the rule of law. It is not only manifest in the egregious and outrageous cases such as the Liberal National Party's Tampa laws, agreed to in 2001, but it is in the blithely ignorant or at worst opportunistic and cynical statements of our current Prime Minister Julia Gillard about Julian Assange. Both the ALP and coalition parties will tell you, hand on heart, that they subscribe to the idea of a society based on the rule of law. But the evidence over the past decade in particular suggests otherwise. What is the rule of law? Tom Bingham, a great English jurist now sadly departed, devoted an entire book to the matter, published last year. His book, The Rule of Law, was a cri de coeur for a return by the body politic in a developed world countries to the principle that all persons and authorities within the state, whether public or private, should be bound by and entitled to the benefit of laws publicly made, taking effect generally in the future and publicly administered by the courts. The adherence by our society to the rule of law, Bingham concluded, makes the difference between good government and bad government. He's right. And we know this to be true because our treatment of asylum seekers is a case in point of the abandonment by the major political parties of the rule of law. Both major parties in Australia have succumbed to populism and fear in this area of public policy and have, as a consequence, abandoned the rule of law. We have created a regime of mandatory detention of asylum seekers, including, shamefully, women and children. We have excised areas off the mainland of this continent and created a legal no man's land. We restrict the rights of desperate individuals to access the courts, in other words, to have recourse to fundamental justice and to have a shield from a capricious executive. Our security agencies are able to behave in the most authoritarian way by making adverse security rulings against asylum seekers, but not telling that person why the ruling has been made. And we pass people smuggling laws which impose mandatory jail terms and destruction of property, irrespective of the fact that the person enabling asylum seekers to come to Australia is often an impoverished Indonesian fisherman. All of this apparatus represents a wholesale abandonment of the rule of law by our major political parties. In the area of anti-terror laws, we have permitted surveillance and control on the liberty of individuals without trial through control orders. We have created thought crime where individuals are sent to prison for doing nothing more than talking and writing. We allow for detention without access to legal advice, and we sit on our hands while Australians like David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib are tortured by the Americans, the nation that Julia Gillard loves with the same uncritical ardour, it seems, as Bob Menzies' devotion to the Queen. Our political leaders, Labor and Liberal, have swallowed the Herald Sun view of the world. That is that the presumption of innocence is to be sacrificed at the altar of populist, irrational fear. So when terrorism arrests are made, politicians, Rudd, Ruddock and co, claim to have stymied terrorism attacks, no matter that a trial has not been had in which the prosecution must prove its case. And when Julian Assange's WikiLeaks disturbs the comfortable, cosseted and duplicitous world of international diplomacy, the leader of this nation pronounces him guilty and orders her Attorney-General to waste thousands of taxpayers' dollars on seeing if the Australian legal system can fulfil her fantasy and have Mr Assange dragged before the courts of this land. This is not only at the federal level, at the state and territory level, with the rare exception of Labor's John Stanhope in the ACT, Lara Giddings in Tasmania and former Victorian Attorney-General Rob Hulls, leaders of both major political parties in the last 10 years have locked up more individuals than ever before in post-Federation history, consigned the mentally ill to a vicious cycle of prison and police harassment, and reversed the presumption of innocence in order to allow the state to take shortcuts in proving its case against generally impecunious defendants. Our major political parties have abandoned in all but hollow rhetoric the idea that the vulnerable ought to be protected by the law and that fairness is the hallmark of a civilised society. As a consequence, the rule of law in Australia today is under threat as never before in this country's short democratic history. Why has this happened? Primarily, in my view, because evidence-based public policy in the area of justice has been abandoned. There is an obsession with security on the part of both the Coalition and the ALP. Focus groups, the great curse of modern democracy and the chief underminer of good public policy, tell our politicians that people feel fearful. This is despite the number of asylum seekers entering our country being minuscule, despite economic prosperity having reduced crime rates and despite there being no evidence of widespread terror networks in Australia. During the last election, the Liberal leader Tony Abbott scratched the fear gene that seems to be prevalent in marginal seats in Western Sydney and South East Queensland with depressing regularity. He promised to boost funds for essential customs activities that protect Australia from threats such as illicit drugs and animal and plant disease. There was, by the way, no evidence to suggest that any of this trio of alleged dangers was skyrocketing under the ALP. But Julia Gillard also pandered to irrational security fears in that same election. She pronounced that those Australians who ring talkback shows and write offensive and often absurd missives on our newspaper websites about asylum seekers are entitled to their view. They are, but no political leader ought to pander to them. When have you, on the other hand, heard a senior member of either the ALP or the Coalition talk about liberty and the importance of ensuring that Australia complies with the human rights instruments it has signed over the years. Benjamin Franklin's observation of over 200 years ago, that he who would put security before liberty deserves neither, has never been more apposite in Australian politics. The undermining of the rule of law by our major political parties reached its low point last year when the Rudd government, naturally with the full support of the Conservatives, retreated from the idea of Australians having their rights protected through a human rights law. In language eerily reminiscent of the way John Howard used to reject the idea of an apology for Indigenous Australians, the Rudd government said that a human rights law would be too divisive. What the government and what the opposition meant to say is that they lacked the political courage to uphold the rule of law. For a Human Rights Act is, as Tom Bingham said of the UK Human Rights Act, necessary if the rule of law is to be more than a slogan. That is, that our politicians owe it to us to ensure that our fundamental entitlements as human beings are protected by law. Let me sum up the case this way. Unlike the UK, where the Liberal Democrats do stand for the rule of law and human rights protections, in contrast to the Conservatives and Labor in that country, in this country there is no such creature. In fact, not even the Greens have demanded the Gillard government enact a Human Rights Act or repeal those odious aspects of the Anti-Terror Laws and the Migration Act which offend the rights to a fair trial, to freedom of movement and speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an Australia today where our major political parties have failed us in many respects. And in one of the most important of those respects is the upholding of the rule of law. The result of this failure is a meaner society and a more fearful one. Thank you.
Shaun, Carney.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you and share this event with you. If you hang around long enough, you get to see everything. I've always believed that, and it's happening to me right now. For a living, I write 2 political columns a week for The Age. One of the animating ideas of a political column is to ladle out praise and criticism to the big political parties, but of course, as you know, not in equal measure. The praise is distributed from teaspoons that I keep in my desk, and the criticism is tipped out by the vatful. I've been doing this for quite a while now. My default setting is, I admit all too often, to lambast the major parties for letting us down. And so here I find myself teaming up with one Liberal senator and one Labor senator to argue that the major parties are not, in fact, failing the Australian people. And 8 minutes from now, I hope to have you convinced that I mean it as well. Now, at the outset, I do think it is important to remind ourselves of the proposition we're discussing tonight, that both major parties are failing the Australian people. Failing the Australian people. Failing. Not a bare pass, a fail. We're not talking here about the suggestion that they could do better. We're saying that they're failing the community. The proposition that the big parties could improve their performance is one I endorse, but failing. Unemployment in Australia is 5%, compared with 8.9% in the United States. You might recall that when this latest figure came in just recently, a drop from 9%, there was mild jubilation and talk of America turning the corner at last. The jobless rate in the UK is 7.9%. A lot of you might not even know that this latest jobless figure actually came out last week. We didn't even really take notice of it because unemployment is regarded as not that big an issue in Australia. And yet, in comparable societies, it is. Inflation in Australia is running at 2.7%, which, according to the Reserve Bank, means that the cost of living is under control. The economy continues to grow. In the past 16 quarters, a period that well and truly covers the global financial crisis and its immediate aftermath, Australia experienced 1 quarter in which the economy contracted. I'm starting to sound like Wayne Swan now, aren't I? The political argument, of course, is over which side can claim credit for these good figures. It's the way politics goes. Labor says it was in the driver's seat during the GFC, so it has dibs. Tony Abbott says the government can't claim even a skerrick of credit for Australia's current prosperity, even after 3.5 years of holding office, but John Howard, Bob Hawke and maybe even Paul Keating can. The truth is, and I think you know this, that the credit is shared by both major parties, even if our leaders can't bring themselves to acknowledge it. And that disconnect between performance and rhetoric encapsulates the weakness of the assertion that we're debating tonight. Wouldn't it be better if the leading members of the big parties were more sensible, more open-hearted and honest towards each other? Well, of course it would. But when it comes to running a national economy, it's the performance, not the rhetoric, that counts in the end. Like it or not, these are the real measures by which we must judge success or failure in politics. And I noticed Greg made reference to economic prosperity, but it was just in passing, as though it just kind of happens. It doesn't. There's no doubt that a greater proportion of Australian voters are becoming unhappy with the way the political system is working. And it would be dishonest of me to deny that some politicians from across the political spectrum are contributing to that sense of disillusionment. But the political system is about much more than the parties. The easy option is to take a quick look and say, it's not good enough. I'll just blame the leaders and their parties. Political parties consist of people. They're not just institutions, they're not just structures, as Carmen has described. They are made up of people. We can get into a chicken and egg discussion about why fewer Australians want to join the major parties, but let's just consider one statistic. The Australian Labor Party has about 40,000 members. I think that's what Carlton's aiming for its membership for this year. And I think they'll get there. The British Labor Party, in a population 3 times the size of Australia, has 5 times as many members. Now that's after the party in Britain has suffered a shocking defeat and lost faith with a lot of its base over the war in Iraq. The ALP's appallingly low membership numbers tell us something about the party for sure, but I'd contend that they also tell us something about Australian society. These are difficult truths to confront. The political cycle is like a marriage. Introduction, attraction, romance, commitment, increasingly desultory coexistence, the loss of trust, separation. Is this familiar to any of you? I don't know. In a political marriage, the breakdown can't always be the fault of the parties to the exclusion of all the other participants in the political process. Looking at the climate change debate, for example, both major parties have been encouraged by voters over the years to establish policies that were potentially very costly. But the closer the parties have got to implementing these policies, the colder most voters have got on doing anything serious on climate change. The Australian people have appropriated and adapted St Augustine's plea on chastity. Lord, give me a price on carbon, but not yet. This morning, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald ran the latest Nielsen poll. It showed that more people wanted Kevin Rudd as Labor leader than Julia Gillard, and more favoured Malcolm Turnbull over Tony Abbott. Now, within the past 18 months, Rudd and Turnbull were ejected by their parties after their personal poll ratings collapsed. Now apparently all's forgiven. Is this an uplifting tale of redemption or a sign of public confusion? I believe it's the latter. I believe that the major parties, to an important extent, reflect the society they seek to represent. The major parties are increasingly addicted to populism and polling. They've changed, there's no question about that. But voters have been changing too, and not always for the better. Back in what we might term, I'm not talking about you, of course, I'm talking about everybody else. Back in what we might term the good old days, when the major parties were not subject to so much derision, they served a dramatically different electorate. Human interaction and the speed of everyday life have been altered profoundly by digital and mobile communications. The internet has unlocked countless doors to information and knowledge, while also coarsening discourse. Too often, it's become a conduit for flaming, and shame on you if you know what that is, and overhyped email campaigns. The digital media enables a growing proportion of the public to self-select its news and information. Unpalatable truths and difficult points of view are filtered out. If they happen to get into the digital consumer space, they can be attacked anonymously, without recourse to the laws of punctuation and grammar, and free of basic concepts of civility. Notions of belonging are transforming too. Businesses now must offer incentives to hold on to customers through loyalty programs. You can't keep track of them, there are so many of them. The idea of a long-term job with a single employer is dreadfully old hat. In all manner of activities now, including politics, the customer-provider model rules and rights now rule over obligations. In other words, relationships within the society are undergoing a series of revolutions. The society that a generation or less ago tolerated missteps by governments and absorbed their economic arguments in many ways bears little resemblance to the society that didn't want to hear any more from the Rudd government about how it had staved off the global financial crisis and certainly didn't want to reward Labor for it. Past governments and oppositions had time which we tell ourselves we don't have. Today we're waiting 10 seconds for an internet page to download as regarded as intolerably long. It's all about forget yesterday, what's next? And because there's so little time, more and more people feel compelled to form judgments before getting all the information. Success or failure, make a choice. It's not the way to get the best out of our major parties, our media, and most important, out of ourselves. Even in politics, a place where there's no irony and the story always ends in tears, can do better is not a fail.
Dr. John Hewson.
Good evening. I want to be a bit unconventional. I want to involve you in what I've got to say. I want to set you in a hypothetical situation. I want to ask you a question, and I expect an honest answer. The hypothetical situation is that you're a world-class photographer, internationally renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer. You're sent out to Australia to take that classic photograph of the meteorological nightmares that we experience in the north of Australia, a combination of cyclones and floods. So you get out there, the winds are extreme, the streets are flooded. You manage to struggle to a high piece of ground, keep your camera equipment fairly dry. And as you're standing there trying to protect yourself from the weather, you look down and you see two people together struggling to survive, to avoid drowning, Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard. And at a rare moment of bipartisanship, they're actually holding each other up, trying to help each other from drowning. So you have a real choice as an international photographer. You can either take that Pulitzer Prize-winning... you can either start by saving the lives of these two people, going down in history as the person that saved the life of the Prime Minister of Australia and the Leader of the Opposition, or you can take that Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of a Prime Minister and a Leader of the Opposition drowning together. So this is where I come to my question, and I want an honest answer. Do you piss around with black and white, or do you go straight to colour? For some reason that makes you reflect on the recent federal election campaign. I think the message of the last campaign to me is that voters didn't really like either candidate. They didn't like the way either of them got there. They certainly didn't like their policies or their claimed policies. And so what you saw was a heavy vote for independents, informal votes, votes for the Greens, a general dissatisfaction with the major parties as they presented themselves to that election. What I want to say to you tonight is that, to me, politics has become a game. It's a game it's a contest that's played out in sort of the 24-hour media cycle. In fact, there are many cycles now within the 24-hour media cycle, because if you get onto Sky, for example, you see breaking news regularly as one or other of the leaders says something which is determined to be breaking news. And in that sense, it's become a personality contest. There's a heavy focus on the personalities and certainly not on the policies. There's a reliance, therefore, on the short soundbite or the media appearance or the stunt that will get you the headline and capture that particular media cycle, that you can conclude at the end of the day, well, we won that cycle, and hopefully that will carry through to the fact that we win in the polls as they unfold in the weeks to come. So much of political reporting now is little better than gossip. You know, Bradley's Angelina. Tony has a rift with Joe Hockey. And when I dig into the story in the Women's Weekly, I find that Brad actually left her inside while he put the children in the car. The same extent of the rift between Hockey and Abbott and whatever. There's very little substantive reporting because there's little better than gossip. There's little substance to what is said on any day. There's no real policy debate. There's not much debate in fact at all beyond the leaders, because the rest of the parliamentary party are confined to deliver the message. So they all say pretty much the same thing. I'm fascinated when I look on Sky television. I have an opposition member and a government member, and they just deliver the message time and time again. And so, as Greg has said, often they use fear as a central element of the delivery of that message as well. These positions that they take are heavily driven, of course, by focus group research, if you can call it that, and other polling. And both sides seem to adopt a small target strategy. There are a few exceptions, but generally a small target strategy. They certainly don't want to repeat the experience of the birthday cake that somebody had earlier on in their career. And what it's meant is a very significant narrowing of the differences between political parties on most issues. And I think this is one of the great tragedies and one of the ways in which they substantially fail Australian voters. Now, this situation, the contest, has been compounded by a number of other factors. I mean, the tendency for both parties to pre-select apparatchiks, people who've only ever worked within the political system, as a ministerial advisor, as a local councillor or in local government, and unions and whatever. And so they've never actually had, in your sense, a real job. They've never actually managed anything. And it's quite significant when these people suddenly become ministers. And, you know, Sir Humphrey has his way in most cases because they have no idea as to how to run a government department. Also, a compounding factor is the accommodating media. The media are no longer as investigative and supportive as they used to be. And in fact, in some cases, the media have become players in the game. They actually predict who's going to win. They support the winner. Thirdly, you've got an accommodating bureaucracy. You know, the bureaucracy has been politicised to a significant extent. The sort of frank and fearless advice that used to be expected of the bureaucracy no longer exists. To some extent, they too become players in the game. And finally, vested interests have a unique capacity in our system to buy support. You see how the big polluters have been able to get their position in either the Howard government or in terms of the Rudd proposal. It is possible to buy significant support. So the consequences of this are very significant, I think, from the point of view of the Australian voter. Parliament has become essentially a farce. I'm fascinated at how many of my friends have been to Parliament, looked at the debate, in quotes, only to find speaker after very few people in the House and speaker after speaker just delivering the same message. Apart from the few debates between leaders and some work in parliamentary committees, Parliament itself does not reflect the debate you would expect on the significance of some of the issues that are dealt with. There's no longer-term vision or planning in this political system anymore. There's no real leadership. Very few people are prepared to stand out and argue for a particular position. They no longer act out of principle or on the basis of ideology, and often, as I said, their positions are driven more by the desire to create fear rather than substantive debate. There's no significant policy development. As has been said, it's predominantly confined now to the work done in government departments, and when there is substantial policy work, as in the case of the recent Henry Review, for example, 138 recommendations, only one of those was picked up, and the rest of them have been, I guess, pushed into some passage of history. I guess the bottom line is, from the point of view of the voter, that the problems are left neglected. They're left to grow and to fester. Service delivery suffers, and you can stand there, any person can list for you the way in which the delivery of government services fails to meet their expectations. I think also our infrastructure is being eroded. There is poor transparency and accountability, and I guess the bottom line is the system is not outcomes orientated. They do not deliver what the average voter expects. So not surprisingly, voters feel increasingly disenfranchised, disempowered. They can become disinterested, even becoming apathetic about any participation in our political system. Helen Kroger mentioned the famous Menzies speech of the forgotten people. I suggest to you that in our political system, the way the major parties are running it, it's the voter that is a forgotten people. Thank you.
Senator Penny Wong.
Shaun just said, I don't want to put pressure on you, but we've got a bit of work to do. Thanks, Shaun. Actually, I was due to go to the WOMAD Festival in Adelaide tonight, and I've been sitting here thinking that might have been a better option. So, if you want to consider the topic tonight, major political parties are failing the Australian people, with which I do not agree, I think there are two things I'd ask you to consider. The first is, what is the role, what is the job description of a major party? And I say it is to govern for all, but also to govern for the national interest. And second, in judging success or failure, I'd ask you to consider this. Success or failure is not popularity, nor is it disagreement with you, nor even your disappointment. The reality is criticism of the major parties is really a great Australian tradition. We enjoy poking fun at our political leaders. We enjoy discussing all of our respective policy failings. People curse our names when the nightly news comes up. Certainly my mother does, not mine, but others. And in many ways that might be one of the good things about the Australian political system, because it certainly means that scrutiny is applied. But I'd ask you to consider this. Don't allow this tradition and this criticism to overlook some of the ways in which the major parties have changed the country in which you live. Just some of the things that you might take for granted today that the Labor Party has delivered. Universal health care through Medicare, anti-discrimination legislation to redress inequality, superannuation for working Australians, the first time working people had access to retirement savings, the opening up of the economy, much of that with bipartisan support that has grounded the prosperity that Shaun spoke of today. More recently, paid parental leave, the largest dollar increase in the age pension, the apology to the stolen generations, and averting the worst aspects of the global financial crisis. And if you don't think that that has a social justice component, remember who it is that is most harmed by a recession. It is those people who are young and who are low-skilled. It is the poorest who pay the most if we go into recession. It is true that major parties are not perfect. I think tonight, from the reaction, we've demonstrated that many of you believe that. But our job is to do what we believe in is in the national interest. And the reality is sometimes that is not going to be popular, and the reality is that that course of action will inevitably disappoint some. But this is not failure. It is the nature of government, and that, of course, is not meant to be easy. What are the major political parties? Well, we are about diverse people from a range of different views and a range of backgrounds coming together behind a shared vision for the future and turning those visions into workable policies. And I believe we do carry a heavy burden, a great responsibility as well as a great privilege, a responsibility of governing, not just for those who vote for us, but for the whole country, for those who might be regarded as being on the left and on the right, for employers and employees, for those who are elderly and those who are young, for this generation and for the next. We cannot be all things to all people.
Governing requires prioritisation. It requires hard choices. It demands the building of agreement and the persuasion of those who do not agree, and this requires far more than compromise. It does demand both the courage to hold firm and the capacity to convince. And when we get it right, we can inspire. And conversely, when we fall short, we can leave some disheartened. Compromise and prioritisation can often be viewed with cynicism, but the simple fact is that governing a country as complex and as diverse as this Australia requires difficult choices. In contrast, minor parties and independents have a different role. Unburdened with the responsibilities of governing, they can stand on the sideline, they can claim purity. Minor parties, in a similar way to particular interest groups, can focus on a handful of issues, directing their energies to a narrow range of outcomes. This is valuable in any polity, but it should not be mistaken for, nor confused with, a platform for governing the country. Because in government, and let me tell you in my new job, this is very present, this issue. In government, a decision in health needs always to be considered against other decisions. For example, decisions in infrastructure. Decisions in education need to be weighed against decisions in agriculture, and so it goes on. And most importantly, we also know that taking any decision today could close off a decision tomorrow. What you would call the opportunity cost of decision-making, whilst it may not be at the front of the public's mind, needs to be at the forefront of our mind in government. Minor parties, independents, can demand more spending in health or education or infrastructure, safe in the knowledge they never have to make a budget balance nor cut an unsustainable program. And just some of these difficult issues. For example, health costs we know are growing at around 9% per annum, faster than the economy is growing. That requires some difficult decisions, some hard choices. For example, there are some in the community and some in the parliament who have asked that we index Commonwealth civilian and military superannuation by a different index. Certainly a worthy ask. The fiscal cost of that is $11.95 billion between 2011-12 and 2014-15. If we were to promise that, that is the money we would have to find. Major parties are required to act in the interests of the country as a whole. Major parties need to appeal and inspire the majority because only the major parties ultimately have the capacity to deliver change. In government or opposition, we have to engage the community in a debate about the future of this nation and to act accordingly. I want to just read from some reports of a meeting Mr Abbott held in Adelaide not long ago. And this is what was reported of the community forum. I'm not a racist, Irene told the gathered faithful. I'm an immigrant, but we came legally. We got patients lining the hospitals on stretchers outside waiting for beds, whereas you've got the detention centres, when they were given beds, they burned them and trashed the whole detention centre they were in. What are you going to do to stop this money being spent? The opposition leader was cheered equally in his response. There's only one way to avoid spending more money on detention centres, and that's to stop the boats. At the same forum, he also said the electorate. He also described the climate change policy the government's put forward as, and I quote, a conspiracy of the parliament against the people. Our job as a major party is to speak to both this audience and to that audience. And it is not to agree with anyone in particular, but it is our job to speak to both of those rooms, this room and that room, and to seek to convince them. We have to advocate reform. We have to build sufficient support to carry that reform. We have to build the agreement. And when we do that, we speak not only to this audience and to that audience, but to all the audiences in between. Thank you very much.